Mahalo everyone. My name is Mele Taumoepeau, and I will be giving the talk today entitled My Mana, Conceptualizing Resilience for Pacific Peoples in Aotearoa. And this is part of the Indigenous Approaches to Psychology, Connection and Engagement and Symposium. So on that note of engagement, what I'd like to do is just first very briefly describe to you how this research came about. It was a partnership between the Pacific Trust Otago and the University of Otago in Dunedin, New Zealand. And this partnership represents quite a long-standing relationship. And I think it's really important to emphasize that these relationships build over time, and if nurtured really carefully, can lead to really fruitful research for both the researcher, the university, but also for the community. The community members who were really strongly instrumental in this research were Taumoepeau and Maria Lucas, who are part of the Pacific Trust Otago, which is a health organization designed to engage in health promotion and supporting the health of Pacific peoples in Dunedin. And Mama Kenya as well was a really important and instrumental person in this research. At the university, the key drivers in the research were the Pacific students. And I just want to emphasize the importance at a university level of providing summer studentships to Pacific students to help build capacity and provide a pathway for our budding and inspiring young Pacific undergraduates to engage more in research. And so over 2 summers, we had 2 sets of summer studentships, and these students did an amazing job working with the Trust and with me in my lab. So what were we interested in? This is the time when, during the pandemic and post-pandemic, when we began to really think about the notion of resilience. And so this research was really about understanding resilience from a Pacific perspective. So resilience has enjoyed a very deep history of research, and some of the key things that we know from past research in terms of understanding what resilience is that it is this individual level capacity to bounce back and continue to flourish following adversity in particular. But it's also the presence of protective factors that may go beyond the individual, which allows an individual to help resist life stress. But more recently, and this definition has been particularly useful when thinking about the cross-cultural perspective of resilience, is that resilience really also involves a dynamic process. So it's not just these individual level attributes or even the community level attributes that allow an individual to flourish, but it's the relationship between those two and how an individual adapts and a community adapts to help that person be resilient and to resist stress and adversity within that larger environmental and cultural system. So with that in mind, we were really interested in what resilience means for Pacific peoples in Aotearoa. Now, there have been a couple of models of resilience which I think are particularly helpful in understanding this. And the first is the relational model of resilience, which very much emphasizes the role of the family and the dynamic role of the family in supporting an individual through stress and adversity. So the family is an organizing framework of support, providing a system of beliefs, a system of spirituality, a system of values, that provides a sense of purpose for an individual and a framework for dealing with stressful events and adverse events. But from a more specifically Pacific point of view, we can also turn to our trusty long-standing model of well-being, which is the Whanawhale model, which again emphasizes the role of the family as this foundational force for a person's well-being. And well-being comprising, of course, a variety of aspects of health, including physical, spiritual, mental, and other, and framed and supported by this umbrella role of culture. So we found that the Whanawhale model and also in the relational model provided us a really good starting point from which to examine in more detail resilience from a Pacific perspective. So in 2 studies, what we did is that we first, in a quantitative study, we measured participants' endorsement of resilience across multiple dimensions of resilience, because we were very interested in this individual but community level role of resilience. And what we wanted to do was try and disentangle some of the effects of resilience on a person's well-being, to try and understand what was really doing the work here in terms of helping a person move through adversity. And for our context of adversity, what we did was that we used the COVID-19 lockdowns as a way of contextualizing resilience and contextualizing our participants' well-being. And the second part of the study was a qualitative study where we wanted to get into much more detail and in-depth understanding of resilience, building again on the pillars from the whanawhale and a more relational aspect of resilience. And we had two main cohorts. The first was a university student cohort, and the second was a community member cohort, which I'll describe in a little more detail later. So if we focus on the first study, which was administered by the Pacific Trust Otago in conjunction with us, we were able to elicit 88 members of the Pacific community in Dunedin, most of whom were women, but a wide age range, and also a range of ethnicities, which actually reflected very much the community that the trust were working on. So this is really important because the trust is going to use this information to help support their work. And so the ethnic groups were very much reflected of the ethnic groups that were highly engaged with the trust. Tongan community, the Cook Island community, the Kiribati community, and to a lesser extent the Samoan community, Fijian, and Tuvalu communities. In the Talanoa sessions, which we administered after the questionnaires took place with a different set of people, these took place over three Talanoa groups. The university students engaged in two Talanoa sessions, but using a photo elicitation. So they took photos of pictures or brought in pictures of what resilience meant to them, and we used that as a tool to have our Talanoa discussions. And then the community Talanoa actually took place over Zoom, and these took place in a different city in Aotearoa. But we separated these community meetings into our male cohort and a female cohort. And again, we had a nice range of Pacific groups. So what did we measure in the questionnaire for the first study? So as I said before, we were interested in different levels of resilience. So we used already established resilience measures to get at these different facets or different levels of resilience: personal, family, spiritual, and community. So there's been a lot of work done at personal level resilience. And so what we wanted to do was to also make sure that we balance that with family items that questioned family resilience. So for instance, we would ask questions which we adapted from the adult resilience scale and the brief resilience scale for something like, so when something unforeseen happens, my family support me, right? And so you would endorse that to a greater or lesser extent. We were interested in spiritual resilience. So for instance, we would ask questions such as, I find prayer or religious practices a source of comfort or support, right? So we had 4 items that looked at spiritual resilience, and we also looked at community resilience. So we asked items around, so for example, I turn to my cultural community for support in times of distress. So those were the resilience items based on past measures, but adapted to ensure that we covered those different levels of resilience and support. Then as our outcome measures, we used established Pacific Identity and Wellbeing Scale, which is a very well established and validated scale that assesses well-being in Pacific communities. We also added to that the Flourishing Scale. And then we also were interested in identity because we wanted to understand the extent to which one's identity had an influence on your different levels of resilience endorsement. So again, we were able to extract from the Pacific Identity and Wellbeing Scale the identity measures and formed a composite score around identity. We measured mental distress using the Kessler scale. Okay, so let's start with the first set of results. The first results focus on resilience and well-being, the relationship between our resilience endorsement and our well-being as Pacific peoples. And what we found was that all aspects of resilience were associated with well-being. So the more you endorsed family support and the resilience, the greater you endorsed a level of personal resilience, spiritual resilience, and community resilience, you felt better in yourself. However, what emerged from these, when we combined them into a single model, was that family resilience was the resilience factor that emerged much more strongly and contributed 27% of unique variance over and above the effects of other kinds of resilience. If we now turn to mental distress, what we found was that spiritual resilience in particular was associated with mental distress. So the more participants endorsed items that promoted support through prayer, support through religious type resilience activities, the less mental distress they reported, or the less current mental distress they reported. And we find that these quantitative analyses are reflected in some detail through our themes that we then were able to analyze through our focus groups. And so I want to just go through some of these themes to add a little bit more flavor to these to our quantitative findings. So the first is that all our participants endorsed a very strong sense of personal and collective responsibility. And this came through really strongly when they talked about what resilience meant to them. And in particular, from a personal point of view, they talked about the importance of strength. So they identified strength as a characteristic that was representative of resilience for them. But similarly, it was coupled with a very strong sense of collective responsibility. So they were very much moving away from the notion of just focusing on their own individuality and very much focusing on resilience as being part of a collective. So we see this quote here from one of our participants. I think that's really beautiful because that shows us that as Pacific peoples, more than anything, we value our community and being a collective. And this was very much the flavor of the narrative. But importantly, to endorse some of the work that we did from the quantitative and questionnaire level, family responsibility really emerged as something that was so strong for our participants, both at the university level in terms of providing them with support, but at the community level, family responsibility was very much their responsibility. So our participants really felt that sense of strong family responsibility. And as the participant says, but like I said, a lot of people are relying on us financially, not only my family, my husband and my kids, my family back at home. So I just have to choose to support them. So for them, in a way, there was very much not a sense of choice around their the roles and responsibilities that they had at a family level. Consistent with the quantitative work as well, we found the spirituality theme was incredibly strong throughout our focus groups and our Talanoa sessions. From the university students' point of view, spirituality was much more reflected in their sense of environment and the importance of environment for your identity as a Pacific peoples. So there was a lot of discussion about protecting the environment and the effects that this adverse event, which is the pandemic, had on the environment, which is in fact quite a positive effect because it allowed the environment a sense to breathe. But for all our participants, spirituality was key. And in particular for our community level participants, it was key at two levels. First, at a personal level of support. So spirituality gave them strength. So if we go back to this strength as an important resilience factor, this was very much manifested through a strong spiritual life. So spirituality provided at an individual level strength to overcome adversity. But also spirituality provided a mechanism through which they could come together as a group and fulfill this sense of collective responsibility and collective support. So as our participant says here, if I just start from here, and if it's coming together to speak about his word and discuss his word, that is, it was good for me. That was something that I pulled my strength from. And this was very much a theme that emerged throughout the discussions. Excuse me. And the final theme that I think was really important and reflected a little bit more of a difference between our participants was the theme of vulnerability that was really significant for our male participants. For our male participants, if we draw on these notions of support, of strength as something that reflects resilience, they felt very vulnerable during the pandemic and during COVID-19. So for instance, I agree it's fear insecurities. You know your kind of self-image or your identity of who you are. You know you don't want to be seen as this softy or this weak person. So for them, resilience was very much a strength-based attribute, and that in this time of adversity, their identity as a strong provider was being very much challenged. There's pride there when he says he, has to provide for his family. He kept saying that, but there's also the fear of not providing, not being that male role model, male pillar in his family. So the themes very much supported and provided some extra nuance and extra detail around what resilience meant for our Pacific communities. And what I want to finish with is a second result that came from the questionnaire. Now, you will recall that spirituality and religious resilience was very important for mental distress. So those who endorsed high levels of spiritual support had lower levels of mental distress. But importantly, this relationship was actually moderated by our participants' identity as Pacific peoples. Now remember, they are all identify in some way as a Pacific person, but there was a variation in the endorsement of their group membership or their belonging as a Pacific person. And this mattered in this relationship between spirituality and mental distress. So what we see here in this scale, what we see is religious resilience down here and current mental distress here. The relationship between low spirituality or religious resilience mattered most for our participants who identified very strongly as Pacific people. So for those who had a very strong Pacific identity, they were most affected if their mental distress was most affected if their spiritual resilience was low. Unlike those who had lower levels of identity as Pacific persons, it didn't matter so much the relationship between their religious resilience and the mental distress. So spirituality is key for the relationship for sort of fostering mental well-being or minimizing mental distress, but it is particularly key if you very strongly endorse or identify as a Pacific person in Aotearoa. So if I just wrap up slightly some of the findings from this, if we come back to sort of, this more general idea of what resilience means, and we start to think about it from a Pacific perspective, there are some key takeaways. And the first one is that different aspects of resilience were differentially associated with mental health or well-being. So resilience was not all created equal. There were some aspects of resilience that were particularly important for well-being, and that was family resilience. And that was really consistent with this notion of this relational model of resilience and promoting well-being, and very much consistent with the Whanawhale foundation of family. The other aspect of resilience, which played quite a key part, was the role of spirituality. And I think there can be a lot more work done to examine in more detail how spirituality provides support for well-being, particularly in times of adversity and distress. And I would suggest that this is happening at two levels. One, at a personal level, in terms of providing some internal strength and support, but also at a community level in enabling people to come together and support each other. And importantly, we're not all created equal in terms of our Pacific identity. And I think it's important to remember and to continue to assess different levels of identity and how Pacific identity can act as a moderator when we're examining the relationship between factors that promote resilience and well-being and mental distress. So thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion later on and to fielding any of your questions. Malo apito.